So it's now my pleasure to introduce to you Richard, who also worked with Mike at Hackney Downs, and he helped to create the first skills for living for boys, which you were talking about, Mike, which included childcare, and he's also a consultant for all equalities in the UK and worldwide. So,
thank you. Okay, well, I've just got a brief slot. What I wanted to talk about really was how does the law help us in it? 15. That's it. And yeah, so law and gender equality. And we've heard already this morning and in the workshops how, you know, what Mike's just talked about. It used to be quite common to do this sort of anti-sexist work in schools, certainly in the 70s and 80s, and certainly through the 90s and the last decade and a half, it seems to have gone, really. And it's not surprising that that's linked to an increase in harassment and bullying, and the youth, up to 35, who've gone through that school system where they weren't challenged, being far more sexist in their attitudes than the generation before. So there's a clear link to what we do in schools, and in fact the insistence on government to really only teach the national curriculum in a way that can be measured and therefore prepare schools to be sold off to the private sector, which we're now all clear is the global project, the germ, which is written about in this month's Teacher. That is what this is about. But what it is also about is squeezing out the humanity of education, the ability to actually educate children for a full life. And therefore we're creating sort of robots, really, in the way that the curriculum is actually being put forward. And that cannot stand and it cannot last, and we have to challenge whoever runs in the election that that cannot be the way forward. But we do have some tools here, because even though the current government, particularly the Conservative part, is against human rights and against equality, and they've made that absolutely clear, and if they get elected they will revoke all of this legislation, they've also made that clear, the Liberals have had some weight of pulling them back by being part of the coalition. So many people don't have much time for the Liberals, but nevertheless they played that role. So we do still have the Equality Act, as passed in 2010. And what's important about the Equality Act, it rolled together 35 separate pieces of legislation that really weren't given but were fought for. Every community had to fight for the equality legislation that we got. I'll give you an example. The disability law we got finally in 1995. There had been 17 attempts before that. The Race Equality Act was so weak that it had to be amended a number of times to actually to cover things. And the Gender Equality Act really was only about equal pay. And it wasn't till quite late on that we had a more general approach to equality in gender. Now, all of these things were rolled together in the 2010 Act, which has 9 protected characteristics, and that covers everybody in the room and everybody in the society, because someone has a gender, whether they're transgender or a specific gender, they've all got a gender. It covers all people who are pregnant or are breastfeeding. It covers anyone with a religion, a faith, or no belief. So that's again everybody. A race, a ethnicity, or nationality. That's again everybody has one of those. Sexual orientation. Everybody has a sexual orientation, whether it's heterosexual or gay, lesbian, or bisexual. It doesn't matter. Everyone's covered. Less people are covered by transgender. It's only about 1 in 100, but that's nevertheless is quite a larger group than most people would think. And then, more recently, those undergoing civil partnership and marriage are also not to be discriminated against. So that covers everybody. But I want to focus in on really that gender, and then there are some related to it, which cover girls and women, and the acts of men and other women, I have to say, in terms of discrimination and how it happens. Now, you can also be perceived to be one of these groups, which you're not, and if you're discriminated against because you're perceived to be that, then that's also unlawful. What does it provide protection? Well, there's protection under the law from less favourable treatment because of a protected characteristic. So this can be direct. we're doing games, but only boys can do football. Right? It would be direct discrimination. It's unlawful. It's not allowed. Indirect discrimination. We've got the school team, and we're doing trials for the school team, but we're going to put that on an evening in November, and a lot of girls aren't going to come out at night because of fear of harassment and attack in the street. Indirect discrimination. Right? So the time that you put things can be discriminatory. Then there's protection from harassment. Now, we've heard a lot about the harassment going on. I think Susie mentioned the Cardiff study this morning that showed 1/3 of children 10 to 12 had been sexually harassed or touched in an unwanted way. Older children, around 16 to 18, it's nearly all girls who've been subjected to this, and at least 1/3 on a daily or weekly basis in our schools. So this is a major thing where the law is being broken every single day, all over the place, because we are meant to be protecting all people from harassment under these various protected categories. Then there is also the public function for schools and colleges and early years funding, which is funded by the public purse. They have to go to a higher standard than those that I've just talked about. They have to promote equality. They don't just make sure that the discrimination doesn't happen. So what does that mean? Well, let's first look at sexual harassment. It's unwanted behaviour related to gender, in this case, that has the purpose or effect of violating the person's dignity or creating an intimidating, hostile, degrading, humiliating or offensive environment. Now, I do a lot of work with schools, and I always ask to see their equality monitoring system, and I have to tell you that 90% of schools do not record gender harassment. They just don't rate it. It's just something that happens all the time. So therefore, how can we possibly monitor that? Because it's there all the time. Well, that's not okay. Now, unfortunately, Ofsted, who look at this, also take that view. And they haven't been trained, and that's their problem. But they are, in themselves, complicit in this breaking of the law that's going on all the time. Now, waving the big stick at the law isn't going to change it. We've heard lots of motivating reasons why people need to do this, and I agree with that. But nevertheless, to convince governors and senior management, which we hope people from here will go back to their schools and say, well, I went to this really interesting conference at the weekend, and it's about time we set up a working party in our school of governors, teachers, support staff, and maybe someone from the senior team to look at how we're actually approaching challenging sexism in our school. And maybe that can then be expanded when that work is done into other equality areas, because this work is no longer being done. We held a conference here in Hackney in April where we had people from 21 schools in school time. It was quite hard to get them out. And there was teachers and non-teaching staff and governors. And we found that by and large throughout Hackney there was no longer any emphasis in schools on equality at all. And in terms of staff recruitment, it was also not happening. So we know that these things are happening, and certainly when it comes to harassment, it's not being covered. So the first thing we have to do is create an environment where people can report it, which means working with young people to actually do some of the things that Susie and Kiri talked about this morning, to create an awareness so that they will report it. Bully busters and other sorts of ambassadors are very important in this. So there are some of the statistics that I mentioned earlier. Now I want to finish on the equalities duty, because I think that has far more use for us than we've actually made of it today. This is the general duty. There is a specific duty which is very weak. You have to have one objective which lasts over 4 years. And most schools, that's a nonsense. But on every decision that the school takes, they also have to have due regard to eliminating discrimination, harassment and victimisation, in this case of girls and women. They have to advance the equality and opportunity between people from different groups. And when there were single equality schemes from 2005 to 2010, schools had to have a gender equality scheme, and most of those only focused on narrowly based curriculum outcomes. And they said, well, there's no problem with the girls, they're out achieving the boys. What they didn't look at was the level of harassment and name-calling that was going on towards the girls. And I have yet to see, and they're all meant to be published on the internet, a school with an objective to actually challenge sexism in the school. It is not being taken on. But the law says that it should be. and to foster good relations between people from different groups. Again, boy-girl relationships, male-female relationships. It was interesting that when we did the thing, and this shows you maybe how far we've come and how not far at Hackney Downs, some of the women who were in the group, women teachers and technicians, got pornography put into their pigeonholes by male members of staff who felt threatened by even the idea that we would do a Skills for Living course. Now maybe we've moved on from that, but on the other hand I think there's quite a lot of tacit sexism still around, and so we really do have to challenge this. So to sum up really, I think this due regard means that the employer, which in most cases is the governing body, in an academy it's the proprietor, they have to, in all the things they do, be mindful of the duty of gender equality in terms of appointment of staff, in terms of policies and so on. So compliance, timeliness, rigour, and the decision can't be delegated from that body to someone in the school. They have to actually go through it. And this has been challenged in the courts many times and found to be wise. Just a couple of examples of, on the staffing side, widening imbalance. The number of secondary heads, the number of males has increased very substantially in the last 3 years, is one example. And another example is that only 3% of early years workers are male. So those are two examples where the staffing imbalance is there. So really, the law is there. The problem is enforcement. So we have to set up our own enforcement, it seems to me, by setting up committees that focus on equality, and in this case, developing sexism within the schools, and to monitor ourselves and to educate both the staff and the young people.
Thank you.